Alrighty. Good morning, folks. Hopefully, my audio is coming through. Doesn't sound like it is, so just a second. I swear. Test, test, test. So, um, hopefully, folks are hearing me okay. I am. Good morning. Sorry for the rough start. um, Welcome back. It's Sunday. That's when we do the stream thing. RDB Bishop, good morning, sir. I hope folks who show up today brought their ideas. I'd love to try and workshop some horror scenarios. That's what we're here to talk about today. Um, I know I have spent the last week kind of creating a lot of scenarios, both for Call of Cthulhu. Well, actually, just for Call of Cthulhu, but um, to the point where I've been not sleeping well. Not because they're frightening, but because my brain goes on creative overdrive in the middle of the night and won't let me sleep, which is always fun. Um, but that is a thing that happens. So, um, yeah. So sleep deprivation, waking up in the middle of the night with an idea. I actually had a couple of ideas that I thought about in the middle of the night that I could not recall the next day, and unfortunately are now lost to the ether. Really need to start keeping a journal on the side of my bed or something. Um, but yeah, so Call of Cthulhu. Um, oh, you listened to the Men from Porlock? Uh, yes, that is very Lovecraftian. Laird Barron is he's been around for a good long time. I just discovered him, and I think he's a great modern contributor to mythos style writing. Uh, he's working with his own little corner of the mythos, creating his own entities, much like August Derleth and Ramsey Campbell and Clark Ashton Smith and Robert E. Howard and all of them also did back in the day. Um, they would often tie into Lovecraft's works, but also create their own. Good morning, mages. Welcome. But Laird Barron very much has its own thing going on with Old Leech, the entity in his story that ties a lot of his work together. Um, if you're interested in Laird Barron's work, do look up online the Laird Barron Mapping Project. It's a website where a fan of his has been going through and mapping out the connections between his stories and the characters in the stories. Much like Lovecraft, Barron also goes ahead and tends to have the same uh, surnames um, thread throughout his stories. You know, like Lovecraft would have the Marshes and the Whateleys and the Akelys and all of those that would appear here and there scattered around his world. Morning, Cody. Welcome, welcome. Uh, but Laird Barron also does that. The nice thing about Barron is that he is writing with a more modern voice, um, and his characters are very much written for their time. I've listened to two audio productions of two of his stories. One was The Men from Porlock, and the other one is I can't remember. It's the Malleus something or the it's. Let me find it here. It's funny thing is it uh, it ties into The Men from Porlock in that the characters in the modern story go to the same location that uh, the events of the Men from Porlock takes place in. Sorry for the stammering. You got me Uh, uh, okay, just a second here. Gonna find this for you, but so the Men from Porlock is like I said, that's the first one that I read or listened to, and then uh, Mysterium Tremendum is the modern story. Um, it's 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 really cool to see how he builds this universe. Like I said, very much in the spirit of Lovecraft and his contemporaries, in that he is writing uh, a corner of the world. For me, it has a particularly personal connection because Laird Barron is writing stories that take place in my old neck of the woods. I am Pacific Northwest, born and bred. Spent first 50 years of my life there, and that environment just it speaks to me. It's every bit a part of me as New England would have been to Lovecraft, or Texas and the wastes of the middle of the United States would have been to Howard. Um, uh, could the Men from Porlock be converted to an actual game scenario? Oh hell yeah! It has everything. Hey Yog, it has everything you need for a good Lovecraft story. You have a host of characters. In this case, in the Men from Porlock, um, it's all very rough, rugged men, which is a nice change also from typical Lovecraft works, where you have rather effete, bookish, often um, uh, fragile of constitution individuals who are experiencing the horror. The Men from Porlock takes a bunch of grizzled war vets who are working the logging country on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington in the backwoods. They are mangled and maimed. They often, they're carrying scars and uh, all sorts of, you know, just psychological and physical damage. Uh, and they're gun toting, axe wielding, and then they go out into the woods, and even these men find something that just breaks them. And that's why it's very much a Lovecraftian story. But it's a great one if you want, especially if you have players that you're trying to introduce to Lovecraft who maybe are coming from more of a D&D kind of an angle, or aren't very used to running investigative situations. Because in the Men from Porlock, um, it's not, let's go to the library or let's go ahead and thumb through ancient tomes. The knowledge base in there comes from local rumor and an old timer. I would have the one old timer there who talks about Old Leech, uh, probably best as an NPC, because he is going to be the lore source. Um, and then, of course, as that story progresses, you have different layers of encounter and different things that grow the mystery and pull the players on. The the hunters that go missing draws them out and gets them investigating. I mean, they start out sent out on a hunting party, and then some of the hunters go missing, and it's in tracking those hunters down that they then encounter the village where the children of the leech are, where they find the thing in the tree, and then ultimately that ends up in a battle where they're fighting the cultists, for lack of a better term, only to encounter something far worse and become very much aware of something far greater and existentially horrific in the end of it. So, long answer, but the short answer is R.W. Bishop. Yes, absolutely. The Men from Porlock would make a good scenario. It has everything you need for a good, uh, slightly more actiony Call of Cthulhu scenario. I don't think it's actiony enough to where it warrants using the Pulp Cthulhu rules. Um, you could definitely get away with it using the regular Cthulhu rules, and the damage that the men take in the story is very realistic, and so therefore is supported well by the standard 7th edition Call of Cthulhu rules. They're not bulletproof action heroes. They are, stuck and shot and done kind of guys who go down. So yes, absolutely. I would say that the other story that I mentioned, also potentially good as a Lovecraft or as a Call of Cthulhu RPG scenario, but that does take a more traditional. It involves a mystical tome or a strange book. It involves people kind of becoming obsessively drawn into something, and then ultimately an encounter with existential horror. So both work, but in different ways. In fact, they would actually work quite well, I think, as a campaign where the Men from Porlock is played out as sort of an actiony prequel, and then the main bulk of the scenario is played out in modern times with the more modern characters and their hiking expedition that goes very wrong. But enough about Laird Barron and his work. Very much, I'm so glad I stumbled onto it, because now it's this rabbit hole that I need to go down. And he even has his own little corner of the Dreamlands sort of an environment that he's writing in too. So he's got multiple places and multiple periods of time that he writes about. So, Call of Cthulhu scenarios. About 4 people watching, and so I guess where I start whenever I'm creating a scenario is I try to find a nugget of an idea, and then I flesh out from there. It seems pretty basic. Sandy Peterson has a couple of videos or recordings of videos that have been done for his workshops he's done at conventions in the past, where he talks about how he builds a scenario. And he's got a very, I don't know if that's just for those workshops, how he approaches it. I often find that a lot of times the way that folks present things in a workshop is not necessarily the way that they do them themselves. It's kind of like reading about some new tool for RPGs and how it seems so weird and artificial when you see it on the paper. But we all do it in our own way somewhere. I feel like Sandy Peterson's stuff may be that way. But for me, it's coming up with an idea. Usually it's either a thought I have or just an item that catches my interest. I might listen to a weird history podcast, and something about that seems like it's an opening for a scenario. I'm in the past, I've been challenged to write things by players, and that has then sparked my imagination. And it's to the point where now I will actually ask people, "Hey, throw out an idea, some random idea." See, Pacific Northwest, Seattle. It's my ancient Seattle Space Needle cup. This thing traveled across country with me. Most of our mugs got left behind, but this had to come with. Yeah, but I'll ask people for a scenario hook and then go to write something off of it. And I find that it's really interesting when somebody gives you something that's not intrinsically horrible or horrific, and then find a way to make it so. And you may insert your Captain Picard meme right there mentally, for the make it so. But a good example would be salt. I had a player in my Call of Cthulhu group who I'm not trying to brag. This is paraphrasing his commentary. He said, you're really good at making things creepy. I bet you could make anything scary. I bet you could make salt scary. And so I wrote a scenario in which salt ends up being creepy. It's not the salt itself that ends up being the source of the creepy, but it is initially the creepy. And I think we see this a lot in horror. stories where the mundane is made frightening. Stephen King is amazing at this. I mean, he takes I'm not a fan of his writing style, um, but I do like his stories. Um, and so he will take the most mundane thing, and having visited the towns that he stomped around in Maine, I can understand where this concept, this mindset for the mundanity of life comes from, uh, because it's Maine. Um, but he'll take these things and then make them frightening. Um, and that is always a fun challenge. But I don't think Call of Cthulhu scenarios or horror scenarios in any case in any game need necessarily be a challenge to the creator. I think it's a big trap that GMs in general find themselves in, where they want to create ideas that are unique and spiffy and whiz bang and all the other like 1930s adjectives you can come up with. Um, and then they just forget that sometimes the meat and potatoes adventures and scenarios are what people want. There's a reason why old classic movies keep coming back to werewolves and Frankenstein monsters and vampires and Gillmen and all those classics. It's not just because they're lazy and they want to remake the same thing over and over, because we've also seen great variation come in there. They keep going back to that because it's what people like, what works for people, and it's a good jumping off point for stories. So don't think that your scenario has to be necessarily some ultimate feat of unique storytelling and scenario creation. Let's see, just real quick. Uh, can ideas fall apart when you attempt to apply them to game type structure? Yes. It is really important to remember what makes for a good story may not make for a good game. I do suggest, however, never letting a scenario idea go, and work it out to as far as you can and try to make it work. I mean, don't bash your head against a wall trying to do it, but definitely stick to them and explore what you can about them until you reach that ultimate conclusion that they are A, going to work as a scenario, or B, not. I think the more weird and vague and esoteric that your scenario fodder may be, the more tightly you have to control the circumstances under which that scenario occurs. Um, Very solid, concrete, easy to understand scenario concepts can range pretty widely in what's presented in the scenario, because ultimately, if you have a monster or a scary place that's doing things, or some horrible machine, your players can always gravitate back towards that. If your concept is somehow a little harder to lock into, you may need to focus the scenario very much on that. But definitely work out your scenarios as far as you can. But they certainly can fall apart as you attempt to apply them to game structure, because some things are just better left as a story, and are only scary or creepy or effective given the control that an author has over the actions of his characters. This is why mysteries in books are always very different and seem so conveniently fluid and work so well, as opposed to a mystery laid out at a table, at a gaming table. Characters in mysteries do what the author wants them to do, and they do what the author needs them to do to get the story moving along. You can't rely on players doing that. This is why you never, and anytime I use the term never, mind you, that's always never with an asterisk, because there's always going to be an exception, but never throw in intentional red herrings into scenarios, because your players will create plenty on their own. Um, Trust me, they do not need help with finding ways to send themselves off on wild goose chases. That meaningless scrap of paper that you have them find or that they decide that they find somewhere will take them off for 2-3 sessions trying to figure out what it means when it's just a scrap of paper. Not every idea is for a game system. This is a problem where GMs try to railroad a story because they want it to feel like a novel or movie. True. I will say Call of Cthulhu scenarios, to people who are used to D&D scenarios that aren't railroady, Call of Cthulhu scenarios can often, and horror scenarios in general, can often tend to feel a little bit more railroady. Because ultimately, if you veer off course too far, then you flee and you escape, or you don't look into the door. But I don't feel like they really actually are any more railroady than a dungeon. I mean, if a dungeon crawl is a confined space where the party can only move in so many different directions, and they have to kind of take it piece by piece. A investigative campaign or investigative scenario like for Call of Cthulhu is very much like a dungeon. It's just the walls are invisible. And instead of monsters encounters, you're encountering clues and NPCs more often. There may still be monsters, but I don't think it's necessarily any more railroady. But yes, you don't want to force it. You definitely want to be flexible and come back around. Find alternate ways to get the players the information. And ultimately, if the players absolutely insist on ignoring the cult that's trying to do the evil thing in the scenario, you can always end the scenario and just have a nice little epilogue session that's like, hey, and on the end of the 4th day, the sky bleeds red. The moon is, moon swallows the sun. A great eye appears in the sky, and darkness and silence fall across the earth. You lost. You could do that. And the next time you play, your players may actually be a little bit more on point. Yeah, linear plot is definitely different than a railroad. Your plot can be linear, but you need to allow your players to veer off of that as much as they want and then come back. The plot can be advanced in a lot of ways that are not the direct actions of the players as well. It can be advanced by indirect actions. For example, with the previous example I just used, if the players don't go after the cult, then you can have them start to hear more about the cult, or if they stop mid scenario and just give up looking, the cult can come after them. Well, yeah, I mean, it was an extreme example, although given the subject matter, and the genre, it is completely a viable outcome. Yeah, and you can definitely have it to where the cult's goals are longer ranging, and this kind of ties into what I was just saying. If the players don't go after the cult continues to do things, and the players can become aware of those, and it can increase the stakes to maybe get the players back on track. But you are not forcing them to go on track, I think, is what you and I are both agreeing on there. You're giving them maybe a new reason to course correct on their own, or showing them the folly of their ways. And yeah, so I want to go ahead and kind of turn this back to writing scenarios. After you pick what you're going to write about, I find it's often useful to just do a quick paragraph where you describe exactly what's happening in your head. This is what's going on, the premise of the scenario. And then you can start. Then what I often do is I start listing NPC ideas for people who tie into that story. and how they tie into it. This is just the notes part of the scenario before you actually start fleshing things out. NPCs and clues that tie into the scenario, into the scenario itself. Start writing this down. If there are any key adversaries, monsters, cultists, other hostile NPCs, whatever, jot those down. Locations. If your scenario involves multiple locations, it's good to note those down early on as well, because then you're going to reference those back as when you're discussing NPCs and items. And then it's useful also to consider different ways in which the players can get the information that they need. So it's always useful to look that up ahead of time. I wanted to share something real quick. So here is my Google Drive for Call of Cthulhu. You see, I've got different folders for different periods. But if I go into my classic tab here, this is each of these folders is adventures that I've started fleshing out, and then everything down here, all these folders here are adventures I've started to flesh out, and all of this is basic premises, maps, things that I've assembled, and then I've also got a folder in my drive for images and stuff that I use as well. Let's see, where's one that I've actually run? Let's see, Misty Waters. Here we go. So this is the scenario I ran. I've mentioned before, I created the scenario. This is about a veterans hospital that is having miracle cures. So for this scenario, I hunted down some period photos to contextualize the scenario. And these are just photos found on Google for historical reference. This crudely drawn or very stylized drawing of Shub-Niggurath is one I just found online. This picture of the hospital. This is. Let me real quick here change what I'm presenting here, so I can do. All right, so you'll see, this image is an actual. This is an actual clinic that was in California. The campaign I was running was taking place in San Francisco. So, we had that. Let's see. Yeah, you don't. I don't think you want to make your Call of Cthulhu scenarios binary. I also feel like the mentality of a lot of players coming into Call of Cthulhu is still that old school RPG mentality of you have to beat everything to win. Or to beat the dungeon, completionist thinking. Sometimes in Call of Cthulhu, especially, the best victory that you can hope for is just good enough. And that's also an option. I also think it's one of the rare cases of RPGs where an ending that does not have a very solid resolution is still an ending, and it can, and especially in the course of a campaign, is still something that you can be satisfied with, because horror stories often have that unresolved ending where we escaped, but we don't know what we were facing. We didn't stop it. That's all going on. That's all still there. So this is all just for one scenario, mapped out in Dungeon Fog, the ground floor, attic, basement, and second floor for the doctor's house. There are tools out there for making headlines. this international moose count always comes up as a default in there, but like, we got escaped maniac, captured, um, and these are clues or background. We've got several letters. We've got a letter from Dr. Fitzwater, who is in the scenario. You got Franny's letter. Franny is the sort of the quest giver in here. It is Franny's letter that actually sends the party to the clinic, and then there's a note found in a room where an NPC went missing, and yeah, so all of this, and we got the escaped maniac captured, doctor shamed by association of witchcraft. Just useful bits and pieces. These are things that you tack on as you flesh out your scenario. So yeah, but as you can see, I've got lots and lots of stuff. But a lot of times it starts out as something like, let me see. Here's one that was inspired by a bit of history that I watched. And typos are there because this is just getting notes down. Murder in Germantown. And this is actually inspired by some of the history of the big beer dynasties in St. Louis. And so, you can tie it in through any little snippet you can come up with. Terrible exhibitions was another scenario I ran. You can see I've got the setup, clues, complications, unfriendly visitors, the truth. I also feel that when you're writing out scenarios, it's really a good idea, if you have a mystery in there, to just write yourself a note for what the truth of the scenario is. The reason for this is that if through the play of the scenario it gets convoluted, by player actions, or just you as a GM kind of getting lost in the weeds, you can always come back to that truth, and you can steer ad hoc clues and interactions with NPCs and stuff back to that truth. Having that banner pole of what the core of the scenario is laid out for yourself is really good for for the helping you with your improv too. It's a big signal beacon saying, hey, this is where we're going. We need to get back there. But yeah, to kind of back up, so once I get my scenario idea, I start jotting down the keynotes, the key elements for it: NPCs, locations, items, clues. Once I have those put in, I start thinking about the actual props and what I need to run the scenario effectively. What is it that I'm going to need for my own reference and or the reference of the players to allow me to run them through the scenario? If it's a map that's needed for a location that they're going to explore in detail, then that's definitely worth getting. You don't have to go as far as I did for making locations in Dungeon Fog. I just like to play with Dungeon Fog or other mapping programs, especially for the classic period of Call of Cthulhu, that 20s, 30s period. You can find all kinds of floor plans for just about any kind of building online through quick Google searches, and those maps are perfectly usable in their own right. And so a lot of your locations, the hospital that was in that scenario, in the Misty Water scenario, it has a map. There's an actual map of that building because it was an actual facility. There are even photographs of the facility during its heyday and modern times, kind of, urban explorer style ones. So useful as well. There are a lot of historical photos out there that can be used to bring stuff into context. For example, in one of my modern scenarios, let me go back to my modern folder. This scenario I titled simply The Oregon Werewolf. But because the modern scenarios just really don't require as much. Oh man, I don't have the pictures on here. Anyways, for that scenario, I went through and found I needed a collection of photos that showed an old World War II German expedition um, in a cold environment. Well, fortunately, there are a bunch of photos I was able to find of um, German Gebirgsjäger, mountain troopers uh, in cold weather. They're often framed very closely, so it was easy enough to just place that cold weather anywhere I needed. And then I was doing the scenario online, so when I posted them into Roll20, I also was able to put like a little caption under each one of them that was a note scribbled on the back of each photo. Usually there were dates with some sort of reference, and the photos I found were able to tell this story of a group of soldiers starting out in good spirits, going out through some cold environment. There was a lake crossing. And then as the photos progressed, based on the photos I was able to find online, they started to become a little bit more worn. And there is a photo in there of a man just having come apart mentally in a dugout. And so I was able to put that in there. So that told the story, and the players were able to find that in the context of the scenario and look through those photos and refer back to them. And then also in those photos was um, a, a tooth that was like that long. Now the photo itself is of a whale's tooth, I think, and it's next to a ruler. Um, that shows how big it is. And I was able to contextualize it by another clue, which was a report, an excerpt from a report on that tooth that they found in a cave. And so all of this was just found through stuff I found online, and you can search for it, and then you can use these as clues or as photos for NPCs. There's a lot of period photos of people, just regular folks out there that you can use, so you should have no problem finding those. um, and let's see. So we're gone about a half an hour here. I'd like to pause a moment and field any specific questions anybody has for um, the creative process for scenarios for Call of Cthulhu. Anybody has anything they're working on, or any stories of things that kind of worked or didn't work? Could definitely explore those as well. I feel like I feel like there is Call of Cthulhu scenarios and horror scenarios are a little bit more I don't know unraveled compared to like a dungeon design or a conventional D&D adventure design. And so it can often seem kind of daunting, but a lot of it just comes down to what your topic is, your subject is. And I would say that no subject is really unworthy of exploration. Like I said, salt can be scary. I've got another scenario I'm working on that involves something very mundane, and the feedback I've been getting on it ranges from why would anybody even bother looking into that, all the way to, oh my God, that's so cool and I want to play it. But, you know, how much? Choice of location. Choice of location is important. Depending on the scenario. But I feel like it's all important. So it's very much important to know where your scenario is taking place. If you are running something that needs to run kind of tightly, I would suggest unlimited environment. Finding reasons to limit the mobility of players can be interesting. I know you're running Horror on the Orient Express, and so that is on a train, you know, on a ship, in the Arctic, in an old house. Those are all great for tight scenarios. Now, if your scenario is a little bit more open, and you can definitely allow for locations to vary. Sometimes the variation of the location is the core of the game. Masks of Nyarlathotep is like that. Um, Horror on the Orient Express has some of that, in that it has the various stops. Um, let's see what else we got here. Uh, I feel like NPCs in horror stories count for more than they do in fantasy adventures, because in horror stories, they are often a much greater source of the meat of the scenario. It is not uncommon in my games to have an entire session be a conversation with an NPC or NPCs. And that's a lot of times the way that the players are getting their information. It's also a lot of times the way the players are getting a feel for the tone, and the nature of the scenario itself. If you're visiting an old town and everybody you run into is furtive and skittish, then that's going to tell you that there's something up. The information you get from every individual may not pay off, but the interactions with those NPCs and their reactions to the party, or the investigators, is definitely gonna play off. Let's see. How many misdirects do you think players should encounter in Call of Cthulhu? I mentioned this earlier. Keep red herrings to the absolute minimum, if not absent in their entirety. It is okay to have a number of characters that are involved, and to have characters that might seem suspicious, but do not put too many blatant red herrings into a scenario, because your players will create their own. And so, on top of the ones you have built in, the players will create their own, and then you're way in the weeds. Literally a railroad plot. Absolutely true. And I almost wonder if I'd love to hear a story of the origin of that campaign, because I sort of like to think my headcanon, maybe Seth Gorkowski will do a video on this like he does with his Gary Gygax videos and the creation of the Beholder and all that. But maybe back then, Mike Mason and Sandy Peterson, or whoever wrote it, are like, we always hear about railroad campaigns or railroad adventures. We should do one that's actually on a railroad. Let's see. Yes and no. Oddly enough, in Lovecraftian fiction, the NPCs the players, the protagonists meet, don't always tend to meet an end. They're usually in the scene and then they just kind of disappear. If you look at Shadow over Innsmouth, for example, um, the protagonist runs into several characters, um, uh, and then they don't encounter them again. There's the crazy dude whose name escapes me. He's because it's got one of those Zebediah kind of names or whatever. In Innsmouth is probably the most recurring NPC in that story. Yeah, I know it's inspired by the novel film Murder on the Orient Express, but I have to think that in the back of their heads they're like, "Ha! It's a literal railroad." Hey, Echo. So the one of the things I wanted to do with this stream uh, was potentially to kind of work on our own scenario, or at least in brief, kind of go through the process. So we do have time. We're coming up on the hour, and I can still answer questions as we go along. But want to kind of maybe try to show some of the creative process here. So I'm gonna ask some feedback from the folks viewing, and we're gonna go from here. All right. So real quick, give me some basis for a scenario, whether that's just an item, a snippet of a scenario idea, a concept, a direction, a mystery, some sort of core element that we can build around. And we'll mark this as relevant. Or I wish I could get my screen bigger. Here we go. All right, stolen mail. I honestly, that's a good one. If I can non-cap locks. So it's funny. I had asked my wife for a scenario idea, and she came up with one that I'm still trying to figure out without seeming repetitive. Hers was like, "Where did my aunt go?" And lo and behold. All right, so core element, stolen mail. All right, so R.W. Bishop, the Call of Cthulhu role playing universe has this in the form of Delta Green. If this is your style of play, like you definitely like the Investigator X Files, then really Delta Green is your way to play play the Call of Cthulhu universe. All right, so get our core element, stolen mail. All right, so what I would usually do right here is I would figure out from the get go why the mail was stolen. Um, because this is going to inform the rest of it. So um, let's just go and jump straight to the truth. So stolen mail offers us a lot of room. So we could look at this and go either, you know, the mail that is being stolen contains information that somebody is looking for. It could be that the particular mail that was stolen contained some sort of item that was being transported to being delivered to the recipient. It could be a little weirder than that. Something is eating it. Um, that's an interesting one too. I mean, you could definitely go with that. And with that, we might find like scraps of information on the ground. So the stolen mail part reminds me of oh my god, I can't remember the name of the scenario. It's a published scenario in which the and I don't want to spoil it too much, but the players take possession of a home after the passing of a relative. Seems very common. A Call of Cthulhu characters in a campaign could be real estate barons in no time. Um, and during the course of that game, books start disappearing from the library. Um, yeah, so that kind of reminds me there. Yeah, I mean, there are other things too. Like you could write into the mail is being stolen because um maybe whoever it is that lives in the home now is related to somebody who used to live there, but is, yeah, Yog, I think it is Paper Chase. Um, uh, Whoever's living there now is related to somebody who used to live there, and they need something that's being there, or maybe that's just their way of checking in on their relatives. You know, again, I'm kind of going back to some of the Lovecraftian lore about like the ghouls, for example, who used to be men and sort of faded from polite society, but aren't quite gone yet. They might, maybe that's their way of checking in on their relatives, is just kind of steal their mail and see what's going on. It's like, and even if it's just, and it could be the most mundane thing, they're stealing the bills, and then maybe if the npc in question, or even it could be the pc's mail is getting stolen, if you want to put them right in the middle of it. PC's mail is getting stolen, and if their bills are behind, suddenly they're finding sacks of gold, or valuables on their doorstep in the morning, like somebody's trying to help them out. And this leads to a further mystery, because not all Call of Cthulhu mysteries have to be necessarily leading into abject horror. I mean, they can, but some of them are just discovering the weird. And so you can write from that. But let's figure this out. I think we're gonna go with um, something kind of straightforward. RW Bishop is on this weird, crazy mail eating thing, but that's a thing. I mean, you could definitely go with that, but let's go ahead and go with um, the mail stolen by somebody expecting something to be delivered there. All right, so we've got our stolen mail, and we got the truth of the mail. Now, this is where we would start to flesh out more of the why and the how. I would say, and you sort of start asking yourself questions as you go down through this. What are they expecting there to? What is it that they're looking for? Is it a book? Is it a letter? Is there an artifact being mailed? Um, perhaps there is. Perhaps there is actually something deadly and lethal being mailed to this person at some point, and the person in the know is beneficent and is trying to prevent them from getting slain by whatever, maybe some dark evil spell or curse or whatever is being sent to them through the mail, and should they open it unknowingly, they would find themselves attacked by some sort of creature or whatever. There are instances in Lovecraftian fiction of entities, and even in a couple of published scenarios of entities bound into the ink of texts that then can jump out and attack people. Um, yeah, definitely finding the thief can lead to someone, or something. I would say right here we need to decide what the focus of this scenario is. Is this the investigators coming in to check out an occurrence that's happening to somebody else, or is this or is this something that's happening to the investigators? In other words, is it the investigators themselves who are having their mail stolen, or um, is this somebody in their neighborhood? Now, you could run this like a Mr. Corbett kind of scenario where it's happening to their neighbor, and they just get wise and decide to look into it, because that's weird. Nobody else's mail in the neighborhood is getting stolen, but just our direct neighbor. In fact, why don't we go with that? In fact, we'll update this. Neighbors mail if I can spell today. Ah, Neighbor's mail is being stolen. 1L. So we got the neighbor's mail is being stolen, and the mail is being stolen because by somebody who is expecting something to be delivered there. W- What is it that we want to have delivered? I mean, let's make a choice here, and then we can go from there. Throwing out some ideas in a very typical Lovecraftian sense. Perhaps the neighbor is um, some academic or intellectual who is going to be receiving a text, or perhaps is even researching a text. Maybe he is um, a professor or an academic at Miskatonic University, and he's working on a project. The package contained a shrunken head. Okay, I, I like that. We'll go with that. That's the first thing we got. So a shrunken head. Now, is this a shrunken human head, or is it the preserved head of a Migo, or some other mythos creature like a Nopki, or a Chocho, or even like a deep one or something like that. That would be a way to go. Maybe he's getting like you know maybe he's getting sent the preserved head of Amigo that was hauled out of the river back in the during this the Whisperer in Darkness, and somebody's preserved it, and he's gonna be conducting some research. This could right here, if we went with the Migo, this then becomes a wholly different Lovecraftian story, because we're now in the realm of the creepy H.P. Lovecraft version of Little Green Men versus ghouls, zombies, entities, and stuff. But could be that it's just a shrunken head, and could be that that shrunken head is an item in and of itself. Maybe the shrunken head is a mythos item. Maybe it's the shrunken head of some Chocho shaman, or even a shaman from some other culture, or maybe even the preserved head of like you know a Templar or something like that, that contains within it mythos knowledge, if that can be unlocked, and that is why somebody wants it. What do you guys think? Medical research package? Okay, we can blend this. Shrunken head. All right, so how about this? A shrunken slash preserved head of a previously unidentified species. Uh, let's go ahead and just say human-like species. Lovecraft loved his human-like species, whether they were man apes or uh, degenerate human beings or inbred families. He loved these, and his contemporaries loved these as well. So we could write that in here. Shrunken, preserved head of a previously unidentified human-like species that is thought to be a simple medical research artifact, or a simple artifact. We'll just say simple artifact, but is actually much more. This then brings in some extra mystery. Going this route, we are not saying it is. We're allowing the motivations of our neighbor to be a step in the mystery. So the neighbor here, perhaps, like I said, is this medical doctor or a researcher or some sort of other academic who's receiving a specimen in the mail. He thinks it's a mundane item, just, oh look, a strange ape head found preserved in the jungles of wherever, or dried by the wind and the cold on the mountainsides, on the mountainside in the Andes, whatever it is. He thinks he's getting just a mundane intellectual, anthropological, archaeological item. In reality, however, perhaps uh, this artifact is something more. Now, we could have it be a repository for knowledge, or maybe this artifact is itself a mythos creature, or the entry point for a creature. And I think this could be a fun way to go, is that somebody's stealing his mail, hoping to get this. Uh, and that's where I was going. So regeneration and spontaneous reconstitution is something that happens a lot in the mythos. It's also very creepy, body horror-y. So we could definitely go with this. And we could build on this. We could start forming a timeline out from this. So mail is getting stolen from the neighbor. The players who live next to the neighbor, or for whatever reason are put in contact with this scientist, this academic, learn about this, and we could, and they, but at some point though, we have to decide: does the intended recipient of the mail, get the delivery, or do the thieves get the delivery? And again, we're at a decision making point in the process here, because if the if the intended recipient gets the mail, then this story begins to take the direction of what happens to the recipient. Where does that action happen? Does it happen in his home? Does it then happen in his offices at Miskatonic, where he transports the item after receiving it? Are the people who are trying to get this from him going to continue to do so? If we decide that the thieves get the item, that it is a federal offense here too. So this could even be a weird case where the players are just playing government investigators from the United States Postal Service or whatever. And then comic hilarity ensues, right? So if the thieves get it, the issue here then becomes, kind of going back to a comment from earlier: how do we contain the action in a way that the players will be able to track it? Because if the thieves get the head and we don't know who the thieves are, we don't know where the head ended up, and we don't know what's going on with it. It doesn't allow for the players to have an opportunity to really take action on the head and whatever it's becoming. I like that idea. We'll note that down here. The head is slowly regenerating its former self or something else. Because perhaps the head is not actually regenerating into something else. Perhaps the head was only used as a container. Maybe there's a fragment of a Shoggoth preserved through arcane magic within the cavity of the head. Who knows? We can decide that later on. If we're going modern, then yes, a GPS tracker on the package. I tend to not play in the modern period as often, so my brain immediately defaults to sort of the more 1920s, 30s mentality. Um, but a GPS tracker on the package would be a great way to make this work as a modern, um, a modern scenario. Yeah, door cams and CCTV are all leave as well for modern. Again, that's that works. This is kind of what I was talking about, where we have to make that choice of where the action is contained, and also I guess the other element to decide right up front: are you doing a modern scenario or are you doing a period scenario? I like this, and that investigator could be modern, or that investigator could even be like an ancient sorcerer, or some ancient mystic, or some, from 100 years ago, even like that. It could be that this is what was done. Kind of a yeah. And you're right. I mean, you could come down to that being the final solution. Although, in the course of a campaign, you don't know what abilities your players are going to necessarily have at this point in the scenario. So it's possible that they might have another means or come up with another means, and that's okay. Um, but yeah, I do like that. That's a good one, General Net. And this is actually an opportunity to um, insert other NPCs. So because we want to involve, let's just go with the route that the thief gets what's in the mail. Okay, and we know that the thief got what he was looking for because the mail stops getting stolen. All right, so mail stops being stolen, indicating indicating I can't spell. Uh, Thief got what they were looking for. The head. Uh, and we can say neighbor or neighbors. Um, so at this point, where we're deciding that we're going to have an eyewitness, there's a couple of ways you could go on this too. You can have it be just nosy, Miss Perkins across the way who's always looking at her blinds, that classic trope, you know, or a more sinister rear window kind of a thing. Um, we could even have multiple NPCs uh, having encountered this, having clues to this. Maybe a neighbor across the way saw somebody there, but she doesn't have all of the information. Like, she could give a general description of their height, how many of them there were, um, you know, but also maybe another neighbor in the area um, ran into the fleeing uh, thief. So, dum always with the jokes, Mister Mages. Let's see. Let's see. Oh, that's an interesting one. I like that because then we can tie this together. Nosy neighbor lady tells investigators that she saw a local. And at this point, we don't even have to worry about NPC names. A lot of times when we're framing out the scenario, we don't need this. We don't need to do this. Local child taking the mail, heading off in a direction. Um, so yeah, that's a good one, Yog. So we got our child given $1 to take and pass it to somebody. So our neighbor lady is now able to give us a piece of the the puzzle. She's seen the child multiple times stealing the mail. Now, we know that this neighbor lady is not overly neighborly because she didn't make any attempt to stop the child, or maybe she did. As we don't need to fill that in now. I mean, it could be that you even just improv that, and as when you're running it, maybe she did try and stop the kid, but the kid ran away. In either case, the kid ran away in the direction he was supposed to go. Um, how did the bad guys know it would be there? Um, that's a good one. How did the bad guys? And I'll go ahead and move this up here. That would be fun. I'm not sure I have the chops to write it out to a publishable level. Uh, oh, that's a good one too. She called the cops. And these are things that you can flesh out as you're writing the scenario. We don't necessarily need to know that right now. But how do they know that it was delivered? um, oh, absolutely, mages. I will. I say that only because I have tried a dozen or more times and always get to a point where I either lose steam, get distracted by another idea, or uh, begin to doubt myself on that one. But you're right. So let's see. So how did they know? Well, we could say that whoever sent it was being watched, and they just didn't get to it in time. That's an easy enough one. That also mitigates and minimizes the need to delve too much into that one. Um, so this would likely be somebody that the intended recipient, the neighbor, is in correspondence with. Yes, it does, and you could still include that information, Doctor Such and Such, in whatever wherever the head was found, was sending this. Um, we could even insert there that Doctor Such and Such was found dead in some back alley or face down in the harbor. Um, showing signs of being brutalized because maybe after he sent the package off, um, they tortured him and to get the information as to who he sent it to, and that's how they know. Um, in fact, we'll just note that down here. All right, and so you're right. We are creating that trail for the players to follow. But so we got the neighbor. There were some questions earlier, like, "Hey, Saxious, welcome." So let's see. Sticking out the mailbox, chasing the thief, leading the So if we assume that the item has already been stolen and been spirited away to those uh, who it was given to, the next obvious clue is going to probably come from the child who is doing the delivery. That child uh, is going to have some sort of description of the NPC to whom he transferred it to. He may not be able to name them, um, but let's just assume right now that the people who he was delivering the package to, delivering the head to, uh, were not the sort to just murder and erase a child, or either that or felt that his connection was inconsequential. They might have also managed to conceal themselves, and that's something that we could have the child reveal. They wore a mask, or I couldn't get a good look at his face because he had a scarf up around it, or whatever. Um, well, stealing the mail may so stealing the mail may seem desperate, like a last minute thing. Um, I guess this is a real good moment to go back to a lot of published scenarios will actually explain in a large block of background text for the keeper what led up to the action of the scenario. A lot of times they'll even have a timeline. In fact, in this case, we would probably want to build out a timeline just for reference because players are going to ask, how long ago did this happen? When was the last time you saw such and such? You know, those things would be important. And but that background you'll often see expressed in these Call of Cthulhu published scenarios, almost like a piece of short fiction in and of itself. We might write out the story of what happened to Doctor such and such, who is in far flung, mysterious part of the world where such items come from. How he found the item, he started to correspond with the NPC who is the neighbor here, who's having his mail stolen. Uh, he then started to notice that he was being followed, uh, and so he quickly, being a man of intelligence and quick wits, realized that his discovery has put him in danger, and he wanted to get the item far away from where he is, perhaps underestimating the reach of those who were after him, and he sent it off in the mail, and that's how we get there. So yeah, it is sort of a you know he sent it off in the mail. The stealing the mail seems desperate, but after it's in the mail, what are you going to do? Um, Staking out a residential mailbox and stealing it from a residential mailbox is going to be a heck of a lot easier for um, cultists, other interested parties to do, as opposed to trying to track it down through the postal service, infiltrating the postal service and getting it there, or staking out the port authority and trying to figure out which shipment of cargo it comes in on. Um, those would be trickier when they can just go to where they know it's going to be and just wait for it to be delivered. Um, so yes, it seems desperate and last minute, but it's also an easy solution, and it puts the action in the vicinity of the investigators. Um, that definitely serves the plot. So I think we need to then figure out what information the child can tell investigators what. And here's where we get to make some choices about who it is that are after the head. Is it a cult? Based on the other stuff that we have here, it's likely a cult because, um, or at least somebody who has a vested interest in letting whatever the head grows into, um, or contains, uh, grow again. In fact, I'm going to move this note up here. Um, so what would the kid notice? It could be that he just notices some very basic things. Um, Anytime I'm listing up um, clues, um, sorry, my wife, she wanted to know if she can run the dog. It's not gonna bug me. Um, Anytime I'm dealing with clues, I try to bullet point them and try to come up with multiple things. Like the kid, we want to think about all the senses the kid is using. So even though the perpetrator may have uh, been concealing their face, maybe there was a scent about him or a particular way he dressed or spoke that the kid can point out. And again, this is a point where we get to make some decisions about, if we haven't already decided it by now, what uh, what kind of group is after them. Are we looking at, a local homegrown homespun cult? Are we talking about exotic, uh, antagonists from across the ocean? Um, if we were going to go with the whole Migo thing, then maybe the man who was there spoke in a very monotone voice, where he seemed to lack any human inflection. Perhaps there was even a buzzing in the tone of his speech, because he's an actual alien. Um, Tall and ancient, so like an old man. All right, all right. So if the person taking the package from the child is this tall old man, um, what does that tell us about the organization? Are we looking at not a cult, but maybe just another Lovecraftian crazy old wizard kind of guy, who's in it to get his own information? This is one of those areas where we don't want to be intentionally misleading. We don't want to create a red herring. The players may come to this conclusion or this assumption themselves, um, even if it's not intended. So we can deliver the information and let the players screw it up as much as they want. But if we add in blatantly false or incorrect information, that's going to muddy things up. We can add in information that's not overly conclusive or useful, um, but I would steer away from adding in stuff that's blatantly deceptive or just flat out wrong. Um, that would work, but I mean, you we can. I mean, so we got a tall old man. Let's come up with a couple other descriptors for the tall old man. Did he smell like anything? Or was there a mannerism or or something in his speech? So, organization and cult is one way to go, but let's not forget that the Lovecraftian universe is full of crazy old men doing weird things with weird artifacts. So it could be that this is just a single person who has been after the stuff. Old Spice and vinegar. Okay. Smells of Old Spice vinegar. So with all of those descriptions, my brain immediately goes to the withering wizard kind of fellow trying to preserve his life. The vinegar and mothballs are just what the kid contextualizes them as, but they're actually elements of some sort of preservation. And of course, the Old Spice tobacco. And we could delve into this is where some research you could delve into what scent um, was perhaps out of time for whatever period you're writing for, because maybe he's wearing a scent that is not really modern. So he's got this vinegary, mothbally smell about him because he's trying to preserve his flesh until he can get whatever ritual he can conduct. But he still likes to he's concealing it with his favorite scent, which is like out of date, and of course he still has his vices of enjoying a pipe. Walked stiffly due to the wooden leg. Okay, so I think that's enough to get our players thinking. As like I said, as a scenario developer, um, I am really thinking, and he could still be part of a cult, but I'm thinking like one of those Lovecraftian wizard guys. He is falling apart, thus the wooden leg. Um, you know, because he's trying to keep himself preserved. Whatever the head, whatever's going on with the head, um, uh, we we can tie that in to his desire to preserve himself, and it doesn't even necessarily have to make sense. What does some entity held trapped in the head of some some ancient investigator have to do with um, preserving life? But we all know that mythos entities have very undefined powers. Not to mention, humanity often ascribes them with will and motive and abilities that they may or may not even have, or even be, and if they do have, be willing to impart. All it takes is somebody who is hopeful that if they do a favor for somebody more powerful than them, that they can get the thing that they want. Um, well, it could be it's a minion. It could be that it is the main guy. What'll be interesting, having it be the main guy would be even more interesting, because that means that the players were that far from running into the main guy, but now they don't have the main guy and they have to track him down, and thereby gets the meat of the investigation. Now he may have minions if we decide that he's part of a cult. Um, if he is just a solo crazy wizard guy, who seems to be a pretty common thing in Lovecraftian universes, then he might have other minions. Like he might have supernatural minions. Maybe he's got some, human faced rat or some sort of other creepy crawly that he can call into action. Uh, I guess we could decide right now um, who this guy is. I mean, we can name him. In fact, let's go ahead and answer a fifth piece of information, and we'll go with General Nut here. He has an accent. Let's say that he spoke with an old timey in an old timey way. Old timey way. It doesn't like it either way. I love that. All right. Anyways, um, because of course this is the kid, so um, the kid's not going to know. Oh, he spoke with a mid 17th century American accent. He's not. The little kid's not going to know that. He spoke like an old timey person. For all, if we're going with old wizard, I mean, this guy could be like could have been in the Americas since early on. He could be a transplant from somewhere else. Um, you know, if we're going really Lovecraft centric, this guy is probably old blood from Dunwich or Arkham or somewhere in Lovecraft country. Um, because they all are. Maybe he's a Whately. Who knows? Um, so Thaddeus Montgomery. All right. Well, we will just go ahead and name him now. Thaddeus Montgomery. All right. Okay. So we've kind of got the start of the scenario here. Mail's being stolen. The neighbor lady leads the investigators to the kid. At some point, we're going to want to flesh out who the neighbor is. Obviously, fill in the blanks there because the players are likely going to go to him first. And it's probably by going to him first, and then the neighbor lady seeing the investigators go to talk to the neighbor, that she will approach them. Psst, psst. Oh, I saw the other day. You're here about that missing mail, aren't you? Oh, kind of thing. And that would then lead on to that. So from here, where do we go? We need to figure out. I guess right here we need to decide solo wizard guy or cult. I know everybody loves cults, and that's a thing that often pops up in Call of Cthulhu scenarios. But individual independent actors or small cadres of people are also a thing. Covens, if you will, intellectual associations, gentlemen's clubs. These are all things that pop up in scenarios as well. So let's let's narrow the choices down. Crazy old wizard or leader of an organization. Throw it in chat which one you want. There's only 4 people here, so we're going to get a small snippet of votes, but hey, whatever. And but I hope this is actually demonstrating to folks kind of the process that I go through when I'm creating scenarios, because it's very similar to this. I mean, this is not identical. This is a little bit more performative and structured than I would go through. But these are the sorts of questions I like to ask myself. How do we know about the doctor? How did he know about the doctor having the head in the first place? This would go back to the folks who were after the doctor. We could assume that perhaps. So if we are going with Crazy Old Wizard, which is what it looks like. So Crazy Old Wizardly sort. So if we were assuming Crazy Old Wizard, we can assume that by Lovecraftian standards, he's probably been on this earth for a while, and he is probably a man of means, and he has likely built up contacts and has feelers and tendrils throughout the world, through various esoteric organizations, trade with cults, through his reading in his library of esoteric knowledge. And so whoever was after the doctor in the far off land who originally procured the head, we can assume that that Thaddeus here, the men who got caught up to him were agents of his, or it could be that the doctor himself was in the employ of Thaddeus and is the one responsible for having found the head. And in a twist that makes this even darker and more twisted, he realized that the head was something more than just a curious academic piece, and n- decided to betray Thaddeus and send it off to the neighbor doctor here who's here. I mean, that is a nice dramatic twist. Um, uh, you know, unwitting, unknowing accomplices are also very Lovecraftian. Those getting tangled up in things that are greater than what they understand, um, speaks to that Lovecraftian nature. So having this doctor overseas, having been on the payroll of Thaddeus to find this artifact simply as an artifact, and then learn, of academic merit, and then discovering that it was much more, um, also puts a little bit more oomph into the players needing to find this head. Um, of course, at this point, we have to remember too, the players don't know that there was a head in the box. They don't know that the doctor got the neighbor was being mailed a head. They know that the doctor's mail was being stolen, but unless we establish some previous correspondence between the doctor overseas and the neighbor, there's no expectation that the neighbor would be expecting a head. We can do that simply for the moving the plot along. That is true. Interference from the innocent can boost the body count. Why don't we do this? We're going to go ahead and name the original sender. Dr. Bentley Worthington. Sure, why not? And we'll just name the neighbor here. Franklin W. Warren. That way we can start referring to them in the story, in the outline. So we have Dr. Bentley Worthington is the overseas original sender. We can figure out where he was sending it from later on, and Dr. Warren is the recipient. Mrs. L.E.F. Bate. The child could mention that the package had something thudding around in it if we want to establish that there was no previous correspondence, between uh, between Dr. Worthington and Dr. Warren. Um, if we want to preserve the mystery of what's in the box, that's the way to go. Is to have the mailing of the head having been so spontaneous that there was no time for conventional correspondence to get between the two doctors. Of course, we very much have to be thinking in the 1920s, 30s context at this point, because modern day, an email would be sent or a phone call. So we've kind of decided where we're at here at this point, unless these guys are both absolute Luddites, and you know, even my grandmother does email. So, all right. So we got to wizardly sort the I'm gonna go say something heavy shifted in the box instead of thudding around, because honestly, we don't want the I can't imagine shipping a head in a box just loosely, thudding around in there. Um, Yes, that is a very good point. Why do they want to get involved? So, with this involving a neighbor, we're kind of in that same situation as the Mr. Corbett um, scenario. Hey, Grumpy Old Land, welcome. The Mr. Corbett scenario. Uh, Mr. Corbett scenario has a fatal flaw in it that a lot of Call of Cthulhu scenarios can be accused of, and that is, why do the investigators care? Um, unless the characters are written into the story as having a personal stake and inheritance, asked to, hired to, it can be difficult. Mr. Corbett, first of all, assumes that the players have a house next door to Mr. Corbett. And in this scenario, we would have to assume that the players have a house in the suburbs or in the city, wherever, next to Dr. Warren. And then they would take interest. We could write into the introduction of this scenario that the investigators, assuming this is the home of one of the investigators, are on good terms with Dr. Warren. Perhaps Dr. Warren is even somebody they've used in their investigations. If you're running this as an existing campaign, you could always rewrite Dr. Warren as any NPC that you have established that lives in their neighborhood that they've corresponded with before. Or you could change it from a neighbor now to somebody in a neighborhood. It doesn't necessarily have to be the player's neighbor, but there has to be some reason for them to get involved with this neighborhood scandal of this stolen mail. So that's a good question, but it's one that you can write into the scenario, and most scenarios that you'll find that are published write from a particular point of view for the insertion of the characters, and then leave it up to the GM, the keeper, to dovetail existing characters in an existing campaign into those scenarios. That's why a lot of Call of Cthulhu scenarios come with pre-generated characters. Those pre-generated characters generally fit the scenario and are made for that. You know, again, if you were to take any group of investigators through a lot of the commonly run scenarios for Call of Cthulhu, your one group of investigators has a lot of dead relatives, are inheriting a lot of property, and have a lot of missing friends or old buddies. So it becomes pretty convoluted and contrived if you start running these open campaigns. So we can worry about why they want to get into it. I would say if we really wanted to do this, Dr. Warren asks the investigators to look into his missing mail. Or relates the situation to them through another contact, another instance of contact. But like, this could be one of those scenarios that works well as a nice side jaunt in the middle of a campaign. Swap out Dr. Warren for an NPC you have running in your campaign, and as the players are on some other sort of hunt in their downtime while they're doing a long-term investigation or recovering from some sanity breaking instance or whatever, maybe Dr. Warren approaches them and says, "Hey, got this problem with my mail," or "Hey, have you been having trouble with your mail?" If he's a neighbor, the mystery could become a little bit more clear if, as a neighbor, they realize that one of their neighbors is having his mail stolen, but no other neighbors are. In which case, what's interesting about his mail? And that might perk their interest a little bit more. Let's see. Dr. Warren is a tenant owned by one of the investigators. This is good. This is actually not a bad one, especially if you have a player, you have a character in the group that has a high credit rating. It's very possible that they are a landlord in these times. So that's definitely a good way to shift uh, to make it fit your game. Every Call of Cthulhu scenario has this particular issue with it. The scenarios are not always going to fit your characters. There are diving scenarios that what character in the 1930s, 1920s is going to have a lot of diving experience to where they're qualified for that scenario? If you're running that as part of a campaign, your part of that campaign is going to be your players having to train up for the diving operation. And then why were they contacted in the first place? So this is just something that you have to figure out with Call of Cthulhu scenarios. You have to write them with a particular intent and then leave that to the keeper to really suss out and figure out what's going on. It's not like D&D where there's a dungeon out there and the party is going to go find it and go through it. Um, let's see. Kidnapping PCs is near impossible unless you have them just thud over the back of the head and or drugged or something. First of all, players, if they have the ability to, will fight to the death. And secondly, you are inviting one of your players to spend the entire scenario until they're rescued as tied up in a back room. It is what it is. Try to avoid it if you can. Or if you are going to use it, make sure you write into it some easy way for that player to get active. In other words, if you were going to kidnap the person, have them be more in a house arrest, hostage sort of situation where they're free to roam and move about and they're not tied up in a back room. Um, Midsummer Murders had more murders that are people in the town over it than there are people in its town over many years. Never stop people from watching. No, you're right, and I mean, these are, Murder She Wrote is similar. These towns clearly have lots of mysteries and people don't stop watching. Um, Yeah, I mean the tenant works as a connection. Again, this is one of those things that you're going to have to figure out when you're running the scenario, and you're going to have to find ways to tie it into your particular group of players. Um, so coming up on the second hour, and I really can't go any further than that. So we got about 15 minutes left. Um, just to jot some notes down here. And I often find myself in this position when I'm creating scenarios, anyways, where I'm writing them on the fly. Maybe I'm typing them down while I'm at work, or between things at home. And I try to get as many ideas as I can out on paper and then flesh them out later on. Um, uh, so we could say, so we've decided these crazy old wizard type. Um, we need to figure out how the players are going to find him. And we would have to establish if we've already set up enough clues to lead to the guy. We have a tall, old, smells like Old Spice vinegar and hints mothballs, pipe tobacco, walks stiffly due to old wooden leg, and has an old timey way. Our witness being a kid um, is not going to be able to give the players a lot of concrete information. So we may have to we would have to maybe come up with um, some other things. The child definitely gives us a reason to look into it by saying there was something heavy shifting in the box. Um, yeah, I mean, you could go this route too. So I would just note down here some quick questions then. So how lead investigators to Thaddeus? What is Thaddeus? We'll just say Marcus T. What is T doing with the head? What will T do to stop the investigators? Where will the investigators find T? So again, we're coming up on the end of the stream here. I'm gonna have to bring it to an end, but filling in questions that you can go back and that lead you towards answers later on is a good way to step away from an idea. I think that's an important part of design of talking about designing adventures too. If you have to step away in the middle of the process and all throughout the process of creating, if a question comes into your mind, note it down. You don't have to answer it then, but note it down because these are things that are going to lead you to steps in that investigation. What is Thaddeus doing with the head? How do we lead the investigators to Thaddeus? And that could be nothing but a bunch of bullet pointed clues that you decide lead to him, and then you can flesh out how the investigators find those. But definitely, what he's doing with the head is important. What he's going to do to stop the investigators, and considering what options he has to bring to bear, minions, whether supernatural and summoned or just could be that he just has some hired thugs. Maybe he doesn't have a cult, but he's got money. You know, when he finds out that the players are in fact, that could be how the players get more on his tail. They could be like, okay, well, we know that there's some creepy old guy who took the head, but we don't know who he is and what he's done. And so they start asking questions around town. We can just assume as a keeper that that information filters back to creepy old man. Thaddeus has probably got some people watching the mailbox just in case. Um, uh, it could be, I mean, if you wanted to really drill down on it, Dr. Warren, the neighbor, could turn up dead. Loose ends, right? Maybe Thaddeus doesn't know exactly how much information Dr. Warren knew about what he was receiving in the mail, because he wouldn't have any idea what other correspondence had been sent from Dr. Worthington uh, to Dr. Warren before his men got to Dr. Worthington. So Dr. Warren, in fact, you'd probably want to go back and change those two doctors to different last names, but that's a fine tuning, a refinement. So the neighbor doctor turning up dead is a way to go, um, especially if he turns up dead not in his home, but also in a similarly brutalized fashion to Dr. Worthington, because the PCs are never going to know what happened to the doctor overseas. That's just for the keeper to have information wise, unless the players really dig into that. However, when the doctor next door turns up face down in the harbor, in Boston Harbor, or washes up on the banks of the Miskatonic, um, even if they were like, huh, well, nothing we can do about the stolen mail, then that's their second call to action. That would then kind of double down. And you know where the investigator is going to find the enemy, the antagonist, is also important. Um, that's possible. Actually, that's a good one. You could write that the kid, in his nervous haste to steal the mail and go, the package was large, and large enough to where it was fit tightly into a conventional mailbox. And so when he pulled it out, he tore off a piece of the wrapping, which had um, the return address. That is actually an interesting one. Um, I will write that down. Because then, even if by this point Dr. Warren hasn't died, the players could look into that and try to contact Dr. Worthington. Hey, we're going to call him and we're going to see what he was sending. Hey, whatever you were sending looks to have been stolen. Can you give some information? And then maybe they then find out that Dr. Worthington is dead. His secretary or his replacement or whatever lets him know. And then when Dr. Warren shows up dead, it's on. Finding something is creepy, running from them is terrifying, and it is possible we could end up with both. So right now we have we have a solid framework to write a scenario, and this is very similar to the process that I would go through, and that was kind of the intent for today. Um, and I hope this demonstrates how you can do it. The questions that I asked and the answers that came out of the chat is sort of the dialogue you should have with yourself when you're writing these scenarios. Ask yourself questions and ask yourself any question. In fact, highly suggest writing them down and not second guessing yourself. Because then you can go back and answer them, and if they're inconsequential, you can just write them off. But it's better that you write them down when you're thinking of them instead of forgetting them and not having written them down. Because from here we could fill in the rest of this. It's a matter of establishing locations and NPCs, building in redundancies. Again, if the players, so we've got the players looking into the lost mail, we've got the neighbor lady coming to them, so the players don't have to find her. The players might contact the local police department and find out that the neighbor lady is always calling in, and she's just a crank and nothing to do about it. That's interesting. You could even start with the scenario. Dr. Warren is out of town. He's asked the players to go ahead and pick up his mail, and then we start the scenario with the players realizing that there's no mail for a couple of days, and then maybe they find a piece of mail that was dropped. So we could definitely start with the players being put in charge of the mail. And Warren is not necessarily expecting this package. Although we could completely recontextualize the scenario, and maybe Dr. Warren is accepting it, but if he's expecting it, but if he is expecting it, he's probably not going to be out of town. So it's probably best that we keep that original scenario that Dr. Worthington found something and he sent it to his colleague, Dr. Warren, who's a professor in the anthropology / archaeology department of Miskatonic University. We can keep it in Lovecraft country. That way, also resources are really available for the mythos stuff for the players. And so, when the mail starts going missing, they can pick it up from there, and then we could build the scenario out from that. But yeah, I really do think that this is a solid start for a scenario, and this is about as good a beginning as you could really hope for, starting with the original suggestion of neighbor's mail is being stolen or mail is being stolen. I hope, if nothing else, that shows that a pretty interesting Call of Cthulhu scenario can come out of any beginning. Remember, Stephen King has written stories about truly mundane things being horrible. Cars, roads, unassuming houses, all these things. Just he's a luxury hotel. These things, good scenarios can come out of anything. All right, so I am going to go ahead and close down the stream today. Thank you all for coming in. Real quick shout out to the folks who have channels: Mage's Musings, The Old Geek, and Mechhead Studios was in here. GM Cody was in here earlier as well. I'm not sure if he's still here. Thank you all for coming by. I hope you found this useful. I hope if you are interested in writing horror scenarios, that you can take this with you and come up with something cool. If you think of ideas to add to the scenario, feel free to throw them in the comments. We can always add them later on. And I'm on Discord, both mine, and I'm also pretty frequent and active on the Old Geeks Discord. So if you have ideas you want to run past me or share, or by all means do. I love to workshop stuff with folks as well. All right. Have a good day, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Take care.